Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Cookie Hymer-Blitz of Fairfax, Virginia, and I'm a board member of the Jewish Council for Public Affairs. Election season is always a busy time at JCPA, and this one has been even more so. JCPA recently issued a joint statement signed by 90 Jewish agencies on elections and democratic principles and launched #EveryVoteCounts campaign. Prior to the elections, we brought together 4 Jewish religious streams to discuss the case for Jewish engagement. And we continue to guide our network in this post-election period and strongly advocate for all votes to be counted. It is news to no one that this has been one of the most polarized elections in American history, both for the Jewish community and our country at large. There are many issues of concern for the Jewish community. Today, we will discuss the Jewish vote, our priorities, what this all means during the next administration, among other topics. When we planned this forum, we had no idea what the situation would be, whether an election winner would be declared, and what would be happening on the ground. And when writing our remarks and preparing questions, we had no idea if they would still be relevant by the time the webinar began. What we did know, however, is that we assembled the right people to discuss the current status of the elections and how they affect the American Jewish community. So to begin, let's go to the time-honored question. Was it good for the Jews? Jodi, can we start with you?
Sure. Thanks for having me. Mostly, I feel like this campaign was not good for anyone. It was ugly and divisive and often fact-free. And it both exposed a lot of really dark and ugly divisions in our communities, and I think made them worse. I do think there is at least one bright spot that is true for Jews and true for everybody, which is the record high voter turnout, seemingly as high as it's been since 1908. We're on track for, I think, 67% turnout, which is, one of my colleagues said on a podcast recently that it's like how it looks in an emerging democracy. I do think that broadly, the engagement around politics and this campaign and some of these really critical questions facing Jewish communities and all communities is inspiring. And we saw also a lot of first-time voters and younger voters. There's more research to do to parse those numbers, but I guess it was good for the Jews and good for Americans in terms of that re-engagement and I would say recommitment to the democratic process. But I would say in most other ways, this election has been bad for everybody.
Thanks. Andrew?
Well, I think I can answer that by saying who's disappointed, who doesn't think it's good for them. I was taken by a headline on a JTA story that appeared in the Times of Israel as well, and was basically saying liberal Jews disappointed because there wasn't a massive rejection of Trumpism. For a lot of liberal Jews, and let's say that represents the majority, they were, I think, not only were they expecting a Biden victory, I think they were hoping for really a kind of a statement that no matter where you are politically, there's modes of behavior, political behavior that do not stand. But we didn't see that. We saw the split continued with or without Trump. And I think that's a huge disappointment to a lot of liberal Jews. And when I say liberal Jews, I'm not talking about left-wing groups. I'm talking about the Jewish communal establishment. And on the other side, if Trump does not continue as president, that's going to be a huge disappointment to the 30 plus percentage of American Jews who not only voted for him, but voted for him very enthusiastically because they think his policies, especially on Israel, but on other things that align with their values, are very important to them. So I'll say there are a lot of people who would say this election was not good for the Jews.
Jonathan, anything to add?
Yeah, I think, I think Andy is right. Just about everybody has something to be disappointed in this election. Certainly Democrats who are hoping, liberals who are hoping that the bad Trump dream, the bad orange man would go away. Well, they'll get part of their wish, but it wasn't a blue wave. It illustrated how split the United States is and how split the Jewish community is. And I think sort of the most ominous thing, the thing that troubles me the most, I think we've long understood, or at least those of us who follow this closely, that the divide between Israeli Jews and American Jews, the overwhelming majority of whom are liberal, loyal Democrats, and who loved Obama, hated Trump, whereas most Israelis, didn't like Obama, loved Trump. We know that divide, but what has been really exposed in a way that I think we've sort of been building toward, but never quite so starkly illustrated, is that there is just as much of a tribal divide. Two very strong, warring political tribes within American Jewry. The 67 to 70%, who, no matter, depending on which poll you believe, that are liberal, that are, Democrats, but more than that, who viewed Trump pretty much as the spawn of the devil, who really, the Jewish Democrats put out an ad, more or less accusing Trump of being a Nazi. And, a critical mass of American Jewry just said, yeah, that's right. Whereas we have that 30-odd% of American Jews who think Trump is not only think that the talk of Trump being an anti-Semite or, a white supremacist is just a partisan talking point, in part because they don't believe, we are we're a bifurcated society. People in this country, Jews among them, they don't read, watch, and listen to the same media. They have completely different takes on everything. Not only do they reject that as a partisan talking point, they think Trump is Israel's savior. They think he's a great, they've come around, many may have voted for him with a holding their nose 4 years ago. They were really enthusiastic for him. And in a country where people are, it's a cliche already, not talking to people, friends, dropping friendships, not talking to relatives because of political differences. As a Jewish family, the Jewish family as a whole is breaking up too in that same way. And I think it's really tough, especially speaking for a group like the JCPA, which tries to speak for everybody within the Jewish community. That's got to be increasingly hard. And I think anybody who is thinking about Jewish communal interests in a sort of big picture way has to take into account that we really are, we all, the UJA slogan from, a generation ago was "We are one." And that was always more aspirational, even then more aspirational than descriptive. It's completely irrelevant now. We are not one. We are two warring tribes.
Well, thank you. Picking up on what I heard from all of you about the political landscape that's more incendiary and polarized, and one in which it's very difficult for people to have a common picture and to agree on what is fact and what is not fact and what is truth and what is not truth. Is this what we're going to see as the new normal? And what role does the Jewish community and particularly the Jewish media play in this?
Maybe I'll start first since I
Yes.
I think that is the new normal. There are a lot of people who are hoping, I think on both sides of the political aisle, that it becomes, the two old Senate colleagues, Mitch McConnell and Joe Biden, will do business together, and, the crazy will leave the American political system, and we'll have a moment, if not of peace, but of sort of a ceasefire, and we'll go back to some kind of normality. I say baloney, or as perhaps our president-elect would say, malarkey. That is not going to happen. The crazy is built into our system. The media is bifurcated. I mean, you're getting two completely different narratives depending on, as I said, what you watch, listen, and read. That was very starkly illustrated during the campaign. You can say one side's wrong, one side's right, but you know what? both sides are spinning, and that's baked into the cake now. That every issue is going to be looked at that way. That you're going to hear about it one way on CNN and hear about it another way on Fox, and that's the way it is. And the forces that are pushing that, are still going to be there. Trump isn't going away. He's the leader of the Republican Party in a way no ex-president will ever be. And the forces on the left who may have been edged out, by Biden, and when mainstream Democrats made sure that Bernie Sanders wasn't going to be their nominee, they're still there too. And they're going to be louder and angrier because they're going to be shut out. So and their shock troops in the media and in pop culture, the late night comedians, they're going to be pushing this too. And people on the other side, crazy isn't going away. The crazy continues. We in the media have an obligation to try and play it as straight and try and tell the truth as we see it. But the forces that are aligned, the forces that have created this tribal war, as I called it, they're still there, and they're still going to be doing it no matter what Biden and McConnell want.
I would just want to jump on that, going back to the context in which you asked the question, which is that I think we over-romanticize the idea that we were ever really all that unitary, or that we were ever really one. It's a little bit of a kind of a narrative invented by the Federation movement, the Jewish industrial complex. If you look through Jewish history and even recent Jewish history, there's been a lot of tribal. Israel itself, before the creation of Israel, was probably the most divisive force in American Jewish life between Zionists and non-Zionists. And before that, you start going to the early days of the Forward, where the socialists and communists wouldn't talk to each other. So I think we over-romanticize it just a touch. But I do think there is something. It feels wrong now. It feels worse now because, like the old joke goes, Jews are like everybody else, only more so, right? We're part of a national polarization, and we're just a small slice of it, but we see it in our own homes and communities, in our own families. And then when we look beyond that, we see it in the world at large. So the world really feels cleaved at this moment.
I mean, I think it's really important to try to think about which divisions Trump and Trumpism and the reaction to Trump and Trumpism and the social media platforms have sort of created, and which they've tapped into. And I also think it's important, what Andy says is so important. Differences of opinion, tribal differences, like those things in themselves are not bad. They're part of life, and disagreements on issues and different perspectives. Like, this is some of what makes our democracy and our society rich. The depressing, disgusting, horrible thing is the kind of dehumanization of people who disagree with you, and the devolution of debate. The idea that you shouldn't engage with people who are different. You should write them off and wish they would leave and try to silence them. And the idea that it's okay that you can have, that each tribe or each political ideology tribe can have its own facts and media, whatever. And I think, Jonathan, I think you're exaggerating slightly. There are any number of us who are out here really not pushing an agenda and really trying to host a debate and really trying to create journalism based on facts and truth and reporting, original reporting, and not on kind of spin and talking points. And I think that that's what's changed is it doesn't have to be a kumbaya sense of we are all the same, but I think there should be, America was founded on the idea, and Judaism revolves around the idea that disagreement is healthy and that it should be respectful disagreement, and that there's merit in trying to understand another person's point of view and experience, and that the mix of people come together, whether it's in the Senate or around the Shabbat table, and truth comes out and goodness comes out of that debate and of that, sometimes butting heads. I also think it's worth saying that if we are a 70-30 community, that's a whole lot less divided than the country, according to this election anyway. So there's something interesting in that. And finally, just one other thing to kind of throw into the mix a little bit is the idea that Jews should be more unified based on their being Jewish than people might be unified based on geography or gender identity or musical preference or we are all made up of lots of things. And there are certainly some Jews for whom their Jewishness is their primary identity, maybe their primary political identity. But I think most people, for most American Jews, it's probably one of many things that they are. So even to suggest that like the right frame for analyzing this is how did the Jewish community break, when every survey tells us that Jews, the issues that Jews cared about most and made their decision on are not identifiably Jewish related issues, I think is a little bit of a canard. So I guess just to summarize, it feels to me that like we are clearly divided, and much of that divide, the nature of that divide in this campaign has been particularly upsetting because of the way it has opened up to like disinformation, demonization, dehumanization of the enemy. But I think that the divide itself is not new, as Andy said, and is not necessarily the enemy. It's not the divides aren't terrible, and objectively, we don't have to all agree. We just have to all care about what the other side thinks and why.
Thanks. We talked a bit about Israel. Each of you have mentioned Israel. So how are the results of the election? How are they going to affect U.S.-Israel relations? Any thoughts on that?
Joe has always had the bona fides. He comes from he's been around so long that he represents an old style of pro-Israel democratic engagement, which is mainstream, which is respectful, which is in the last Netanyahu has been in power for most of those 40 years, I think. So I'm joking, of course. But I think Biden will probably aim for, I respectfully disagree with my good friend Bibi. He said this, Bibi, I love you, but I disagree with everything you stand for. I don't think it's very high in his agenda right now. I don't think it's very high in anybody's agenda. I don't think we'll get to the lows of the Obama period, only because I think it's going to be a lot harder to demonize Biden than it was to demonize Obama, who was new, who was unknown, who was Black, and who had the middle name Hussein. So I think basically the Biden will be a bit of a reset. I think Israel's a little bit nervous because they had such a green light with the Trump administration. But then again, Israel is not, in Israel, obviously, the polls there showed a lot of enthusiasm for Trump. I don't think you're going to see this great realignment right now. Not under Biden. He's not that kind of politician.
I partially agree with that. I think the thing about Obama, yes, he was easier to see as someone as a threat, but that was not just because of the reasons you listed, it's because of policy. He's the one who came into office saying, we need more daylight between the US and Israel. He's the one who basically latched onto the idea of a rapprochement with Iran, which not just scared Israel, but scared all the Arab states into Israel's arms. Netanyahu kind of fed into that. It was personal. Netanyahu exploited it.
Jonathan Tobin credited Obama with the rapprochement between Israel and the Arab states.
Yeah, I've done it before in print. Of course, it was the law of unintended consequences.
Right.
He set out to make peace in the Middle East. It wasn't the peace he intended.
Yeah.
So the policies, drove it. That's not necessarily Biden. Biden was part of that administration. Biden, I'm sure, wants to be his own man, but there's always the impulse with the new administration, let's do everything different from the previous administration. That drove Obama, it drove Trump, it's driven every president in many ways. The question is, how different? I agree with Andy, that it's hard for me to imagine that, going down the rabbit hole of trying to entice the Palestinians to come back to the negotiating table seems like a really dumb use of scarce political capital on the part of Biden. That's a fight he doesn't need. He's going to have enough to deal with. But I will, tell a story on myself. 12 years ago, minus a month, I think in December of 2008, when we were after Obama had been elected, we were anticipating what he was going to do. I wrote a column in the forward saying Obama is too smart to prioritize, trying to start up the Middle East peace process, which had just collapsed for the umpteenth time just before that at Annapolis. He's not going to make that. He's got other priorities. He's not going to get into fights with Israel. What does he need that for? Well, not the first time, not the last time I got something wrong.
Well, you weren't entirely wrong. I mean, you know, he waited a good long time to do anything, and it was really Secretary Kerry, who led that process. And President Obama never thought there was like much promise in those talks and did not invest terribly much in it.
I think actually in 2010, the Arab, the Arab Spring speech, or 2011, the dust up over Biden's visit to Jerusalem, the spats had all through his first term. It got worse when Kerry, who really committed to reviving the negotiation process, but it was always there. And I might add something else. I think it's important. Anybody who thinks that a President Biden who followed Obama's policies, who sort of listened to all the Obama alumni who are going to be, back in the National Security Council and, in the State Department, that's not going to be bad for Bibi. We forget, his reign of 11 and a half years began and was strengthened with every pressure by Obama on Netanyahu, strengthened him at home. He waxed in strength. Conversely, with every effort to portray himself as the victim, he was the guy standing up to the big bully Americans. If Biden went down that road again, it would be the best thing possible. For Netanyahu, because he would fend off his right-wing frenemies and who would have to be silent again. Trump was great for Netanyahu in some ways, but it also kind of removed some of his security blanket in other ways. So life is full of ironies.
Let's talk for a second, focus on anti-Semitism, certainly something that's on everybody's minds. And a lot of our viewers have questions about that. No, it's clear that anti-Semitism has become a political weapon used by every side to for their own benefit and to create leverage. To what degree have you seen anti-Semitism on the ballot in this election, and in what way?
Well, I mean, I think Andy wrote about this this week. Joe Biden has said repeatedly that the final thing that pushed him to enter the race for the presidency was Charlottesville. When, of course, at the Unite the Right rally, when people were chanting, "Jews will not replace us, you will not replace us," and when President Trump said there were very fine people on both sides. And essentially, he has said very directly to Jewish audiences as well as to mainstream audiences in the first debate, he said basically, I ran for president because of anti-Semitism and because of, hate speech being kind of unleashed and accepted from the highest offices and the dangers that happens. So I think that we are clearly, we have seen a rise in anti-Semitic violence and anti-Semitic hate speech online. We see anti-Semitism underpinning a lot of the conspiracy theories and groups like QAnon and others. And I think, that is like a new normal in our day-to-day discourse that will be very, very hard to put back into the bottle, but that is very present, I think, and is probably the thing that most unites the Jewish community. There are certainly people in that 30%, as well as people in that 70% who are deeply worried about the rise of anti-Semitism in their own lives, whether it's about, fear of more synagogue shootings. We just had the Vienna shooting this week. Or whether it's about the kind of harassment that they see online, on college campuses, et cetera. So I feel like the question of, what kind of leadership would a President Biden show? What kind of, what will happen imagine a post-presidency Trump, and how he relates to different constituencies who are disenfranchised by this result. There's a lot of big questions as to what will happen next. But I think that, this is a critical issue for all of us.
I've always maintained, the question was always, for the last 5 years is, was Trump an anti-Semite? And my glib answer was always, I don't know, and I don't care. What I do know is that he was good for anti-Semitism, which is, and not just anti-Semitism, but in a world in which so much vitriol and intolerance is coming out of the bully pulpit, it's going to have consequences. It's going to leach down and it's going to be directed, to quote, an old poem, first they came for the Mexicans. And it kind of felt like that through the last 5 years. I was just, I was listening in on a Jewish organization that just had done some surveying on anti-Semitism. And they would not be pinned down on whether it had anything to do with what was happening politically in his country. But they kept saying that they noticed the rise in anti-Semitism over the last 5 years, which leaves you scratching your head saying, what happened in the last 5 years? That seems, and our inability to say that. And I think a lot of people are hoping for a reset because, you don't have to be anti-Semitic to create an atmosphere in which it flourishes. But you do have to be as a leader who says, listen, there are ideas that are American and there are ideas that are not American. And the demonizing of immigrant groups, the demonizing of religious groups is not American. I will not be party to it, even if it might cost me votes, even if it might cost me really positive Twitter likes. I'm going to say right now, if you stand for this ideology, if you stand for this conspiracy theory, please do not count yourself among my followers.
Well, I think we are faced with, a clear problem in that we have different kinds of anti-Semitism from the left, from the right. And at times there's been a reluctance, and Trump is certainly guilty of this, where he, part of it is his petulance. You want him to say something, he won't say it. That's it's sort of one of his character flaws. And also, he not unreasonably understood that no matter how many times he condemned something, he was still going to be asked to condemn it again, and he just wouldn't do it. And that was unfortunate. That was wrong. The idea that he was an anti-Semite, clearly he's not an anti-Semite. And I think there was a lot of connecting of the dots that sometimes people don't want to do with respect to people on their side of the spectrum. Or on, it's like we had this tremendous outbreak of anti-Semitic violence against Orthodox Jews this time last year in the greater New York area. And there was a lot of reluctance to connect the dots from, say, the influence of Louis Farrakhan, an extremist or intersectional idea of thinking, and the way it filters down into the African American community. You can always say, certainly, that Trump, because he certainly helped course in American discourse, he didn't invent it, he just exemplified it, that creates an atmosphere that makes things worse. But also, there has been weaponizing of anti-Semitism, as there's weaponizing of everything. In a presidential election year, everything is about politics. And we need, in the next administration, it would be nice, I would hope that Biden will sound, sounding more dignified and given more unambiguous condemnation of anti-Semitism, not just of QAnon and far right, right-wingers, that people connected to Trump, but to anti-Semitism from people on his own side of the spectrum. And that's important too. So we can hope for that. My worry is that things get so politicized, things get so bifurcated that people forget to do it. And we see that in our community as well. People can always see the flaws of people with whom they have political disagreements, other than that. They have trouble seeing the flaws on their own. They're political allies. And that's very, it's a difficult thing for people to do that. And they're always going to be reluctant, but we have to push them to do it, whether it's on the right or the left.
Well, one of the surprises in this election was the segment of Latino votes that trended toward Trump. What do you think this says about how the Jewish community should take note of it? What should we get out of it? How should we respond? And is perhaps the political correctness, for want of another word, of liberal Jews to the left who are driving some of the agenda, could that be one factor that is alienated some Latinos from voting Democratic as they have in the past?
I want to jump in on this a little because I want to recommend anyone who asked that question who is interested in this topic should read an article in today's Los Angeles Times by one of my favorite writers, Gustavo Arliano, Arellano, where he's asked that exact question as a Mexican American, what happened to the Hispanics? His answer could have been anything. Jodi or Jonathan or I could have written the exact same column, but just plugged in the Jews, where he said, first of all, 70% of us voted for Trump, and yet you're blaming us for Florida. And he said, two, the idea of his Latino unity is such an illusion, because we are, like Jodi said before, we are a very divided and very contentious community that comes from many, many parts of the world. So it's a really smart piece, but as I'm reading it, I'm just saying, wow, this is basically Judaism, but with a Spanish accent, right? So, and I think, the answer really is that we should continue, and I know JCPA does this, to make coalitions with minority groups like us, who we may not always agree with, partly because they're not all, they're not monoliths, and you never know what'll work when you need them. So those are just two quick answers to that, but read Gustavo.
Hidden in your question, Cookie, I think is one of the biggest problems that faces our community and maybe America at large, which is that people, liberals, white liberals, Jewish liberals, educated liberals, Jewish liberals, I think really are very simplistic and stereotyping when they try to imagine the Trump voter. They have not done enough hard work to understand the Trump voter. They have not cared enough. Huge swaths of our communities have written off the people who voted for Trump in 2016 and who continue to support him as racists and misogynists, and they cannot imagine, and their only explanation for Latinos voting for Trump is they're voting against their own interests. And it is an elitist, disrespectful way of thinking. There are lots of reasons people voted for Donald Trump. You can read about them in any number of sources, including the Forward, where we have run any number of pieces of opinion pieces and essays by Trump voters explaining why they love President Trump or why they're reluctantly supporting him or whatever. Some of the reasons that Latinos, I think, supported President Trump, although I don't, I haven't done deep reporting on this, but some of them that might not be the ones that that your question kind of implies are like, lots of Latinos are small business owners who are in, deep trouble right now over the pandemic and who are desperate to have the economy open up. And he promised that. And he also delivered tax cuts to them for the first few years of his administration. Also, large groups of Latinos are religious Catholics. And there have been any number of moves that Trump and his administration and federal judges he's appointed have done to that are good for religious people and people who want a little bit more protection around religion and public life. Those are not things that like Reform Jews care about. And Reform Jews think they care about Latinos, so they think they understand their issues. But like those are things that actual Latinos, actual working class Latinos, actual church-going Latinos care deeply about. And there's probably any number of other ones. But, we I think, there's the big barrier on like not actually trying to hear what a Trump supporter is saying about why they love him. I thought in 2016, the media massively missed the story because they didn't spend enough time trying to understand what was motivating Trump voters and the way in which Trump tapped into movements that were already existing. One of the reasons I think people supported him in 2016 had to do with just the way that Trump embodied the American dream. He was rich and famous and successful, and that's what most people wanted to be. 4 years later, I think that's a little bit different because of course, there's now what he's been in the White House to have a referendum on. And I've spent a lot of time thinking this week that I don't understand exactly what motivated half the country to support President Trump. And I'm interested in finding out more about that. But I think the sort of sense of, Trump is bad for Black and brown people, how could Black and brown people support him, is a really naive, elitist view that we need to fight against. And if you want to know why Latino people voted for President Trump, people should make more efforts to read their media, talk to them, et cetera, and not like guess what you think is good for them.
Yeah, I'd like to jump in. I think Jodi really hit on that. I don't think most liberal Jews, I disagreed with the premise of the question that like, what should liberal Jews do about, Hispanics voting for Trump? I mean, that's not not for us to tell people how to vote. More to the point, I think a lot of people have really missed, I think, including a lot of pundits who are conservatives, missed what happened in the last 4 or 5 years. The Republican Party has realigned. It is now much more it is not, sort of the party that was sort of really aligned with Wall Street, run by my friend Bill Kristol and the rest of the, sort of insiders, people from the Bush administration's Mitt Romney supporters. That Republican Party is gone. The one that Trump has built, almost while no one was looking, is a more working class oriented party. And it is one that, to the amazement of all, is actually more attractive to Hispanics and even Blacks. Trump got a higher percentage of the African-American vote than any Republican has in a long while this time, and he appeals to people who, embrace traditional religious values, who, distrust, the Washington establishment, and more to the point, sort of the governing and educated classes of this country, which has long embraced, conservatives as well as liberals. That is something, not everybody likes that, but, that is something that has truly engaged. And even sort of, one of the misconceptions, if you're talking about why do people support Trump, and, it's a cliche, that Republicans sold their souls to, by latching on to Trump. The truth is, it was Trump who sold his soul. Trump, who embraced longstanding conservative positions on religious liberty and, a host of other agendas that, pre-2015, New York real estate mogul Trump had no interest in, or maybe even knowledge of. And that includes the pro-Israel agenda. That's what he's done. And, most Republicans, the Gallup tracking poll showed that 94% of Republicans were backing Trump, even in the last month, and when the pandemic was worse. No Republican president or candidate has ever gotten that high, a favorability from his own party. So, my never Trump friends, who get a lot of ink in the mainstream media, were really representing a very small segment.
So, Jonathan, explain to me, as if you can explain to me, but explain to me what that blanket support is about. Is it a set of policies and we'll swallow the nonsense because it's a set of policies, or is it the nonsense that's the thing? It's the attitude. It's the owning the libs and all that other stuff. I think that was why. When it was Bush and he kind of ran out of steam, Republicans, soured on him and were ready for a change. But this loyalty that gets intensified in the midst of what appears to be incompetence, let's say, on the coronavirus, what appears to be, narcissism, it's all the other things that you can pin on Trump that I think you can objectively pin on Trump. What is that about policy, or is that about the person?
It's both. And, and I was very slow to, let me just call out myself. I was very slow to understand this myself. There is an appeal about him, half the country, or whatever, 48%, a considerable portion of that, they really like him. They like the fact that he is basically giving the middle finger to everybody they don't like. And that includes, us in the media. And a whole host of other, sort of people that they don't like, that many Americans resent. He's a middle finger to sort of the whole culture of political correctness and cancel culture. But yes, for conservatives, for many conservatives, it's also a policy thing, because ironically, even though he's the least conservative in terms of his personal demeanor and in terms of his background, he's about the least conservative Republican you can imagine. In some ways, he's been the most successful. He was the most successful conservative president in getting things that conservatives want. So, it was kind of a package deal. And we also underestimate the appeal of his energy and his, he has a certain charisma. His charms are lost on a lot of us, let's be honest. But people really admire that. He he doesn't take any guff from anybody. The fact that he's always the quote unquote counterpunching, which is always, it's always mistaken, it's always miscalculated, but yet it also engenders a degree of admiration. He doesn't take any crap from the anchor men or for whoever it is. People like that. A lot of people like that. And, my colleague Selena Zito said it best 5 years ago. She was the first to glom onto it. It's always worth repeating. Trump's critics take him literally, but not seriously. Trump's fans take him seriously, but not literally.
Okay. A little bit different question. What do you see happening to the now defunct Iran deal? Will Biden try and reinstate the Iran deal? And how will that play out potentially?
I'll just jump in. Obviously, he's going to re-enter it. He's made that really clear. What's not clear is how enthusiastic is he for Barack Obama's foreign policy legacy. I think Tony Blinken, his foreign policy advisor, has sort of tried to make noises on both sides of this, saying, yes, we'll re-enter it, but no, we won't drop sanctions. The truth is, whether you were an enthusiast for this deal or diehard opponent or somewhere in the middle, I think everybody who's who really understands or studies it knows that at some point the West is going to have to try and renegotiate the deal because the sunset clauses, will be here before you know it. And if you want to restrain Iran as a rogue actor, or you're really worried about it, and certainly the Gulf states and Israel still are, this will have to be addressed. Trump jumped in, did it sooner than perhaps some people would think was necessary, applied economic pressure. John Kerry told the Iranians, don't worry, just be patient. But I think if the only answer from a Biden administration is, okay, we're just going to go back to where we were 4 years ago, that's a vulnerability, and that is something that will be a problem that he'll have to address. Maybe he'll get cheers from our European allies who want to trade with Iran and were dragged kicking and screaming by Trump's decisions into a sort of a more anomalous relationship. But at some point, the West does have to address the next step. It can't just be kicked down the road indefinitely. That's the bottom line. And we'll see whether he has the energy, the political capital, or the will to do more than just pay lip service to this issue. That's interesting to me, and I don't know the answer.
Anybody else?
No, I can leave it there. It was excellent. Thanks, Jonathan.
A little bit different topic again. We have all certainly seen the issue of racial equity and justice be on the forefront of national conversations, even though those conversations may sound different depending on who's engaging in them. How did you see these issues playing out in this election? And might the election change the current dynamic and discussion?
I mean, I can start a little bit. I think one way it played out that I found really troubling was a lot of the rhetoric from President Trump about cities, which is sort of code, I think, for people of color. And there was just quite a lot of this idea of the unrest and the chaos of Democrat-run cities was like a trope that I think he was really using to just stoke fear. And most of it was just totally unfounded. And I thought it was really dangerous. I think, it is certainly true that the forces on the left and in the Democratic Party that are most focused on anti-racism and on things like reforming or defunding or abolishing the police, that is not, the Biden Democratic Party. So I think that, Biden is a very mainstream kind of old-fashioned Democrat. So I'm not sure that that agenda is top focus, although one of the things that we've seen since May is the kind of mainstreaming of an agenda around anti-racism that is, I think, really encouraging. I mean, something that was generally perceived as like niche issue of a certain segment of the community, the left community, and a certain, mostly the responsibility of people of color and the focus of people of color has become a mainstreamed priority for not just liberals, but I think many corporations, many institutions. And so I think, it would be more central to the administration, but I think it's part of what we have to, there's some repair work to do, because there was so much ugliness in the campaign, often coded around race.
I was really disheartened during the summer, I guess, at the height of the protests, about how many Jews I heard from, including Jewish leadership, whose first question about this was, have the protesters for racial justice, deserve? I mean, that was really how they framed it, the support of the Jewish community. And, their first impulse when they see, people of color and their allies protesting police shootings is to ask, well, where's Black Lives Matter on Israel? And what about that platform 3 years ago? And, where were they when there was anti-Semitism? And I just find it a disheartening question, because I think part of the Jewish ethos is that justice is its own reward. You don't have to prove your bona fides for me to be your ally. And I also think that, this so-called anti-Semitic strain in the Black Lives Matter movement was irrelevant to the point of not being interesting. So that was disheartening. And I think as a result of that, we lost an opportunity to, as a community, I think, to form really strong coalitions with people around an issue that should animate everybody. This isn't a Black issue. This is an American issue. We want our police forces to be professional and effective and keep us all safe. And that means keeping us safe from the bad guys and keeping us safe from rogue cops. And that's all it was about. And it's a shame that it became something more.
I think, I don't entirely disagree with what Andy said about Jews, sort of judging, the African-American community and its priorities. No, not everything is about Israel and Zionism, although calling out anti-Semites or anti-Israel, Farrakhan supporters within the Black Lives Matter movement is not illegitimate. When Tamika Mallory becomes, the most visible person in the Breonna Taylor case, that's something worth noticing. However, I think to the extent, if you're talking about something that really helped Donald Trump this year, it was the spectacle of people demonizing the police, calling for defunding the police, abolishing the police, and, the spectacle of, kind of mostly peaceful protests that weren't always so peaceful. It was scary to people. And I think more than that, the quote unquote anti-racism movement, which is rooted in sort of very, top, as far as I'm concerned, and I think much of America is concerned, and not just Trump voters, this notion of white fragility. And I might add, which tends to classify Jews as part of, this sterile, foolish debate, are Jews white? Are Jews part of white oppression? That is a real turnoff to people. That really scared people, that angered people. And it's connected with the whole, sort of crazy cancel culture, delegitimization of people that is so troubling. It seems to be antithetical to free speech. It is really not a productive force for our society in general. And I think there was pushback, against that. I think that was entirely normal, and it wasn't necessarily, you can say some people were racist. Well, I think a lot of the pushback against the rhetoric that tended to revolve around the Black Lives Matter movement, the discussion of the police, was, profoundly offensive to many Americans. And if you're looking, it's bound up with a whole raft of intellectual ideas, the 1619 Project of the Times, and the idea of, how are we, is America an irredeemably racist nation? That is not how you build a consensus. That is how you polarize. And, you shouldn't be surprised when that polarizes both ways.
Seeking Jewish unity and clarity, which is the understanding that we are going to disagree on issues, and that is the reality. As editors, reporters, media leaders, what is your recommendation to Jewish organizations to encourage this new type of Jewish unity?
You know, I've spent much of the last 4 years doing a debate program with our colleague and friend, J.J. Goldberg, the former editor of The Forward. And we have gone around the country innumerable times, seemingly, debating, doing our liberal conservative thing, but we always conclude it by each giving our own take on why it's so important to listen to the other side and why you have to try and read both sides. You have to try and engage with people. We are, as I said before, a bifurcated nation, not just Jews, but all Americans. You know, we are, yes, you know, we're lots of different things, but we are very tribal right now as far as politics. I mean, it's, you know, Jews spend a lot of time talking about, you know, in the last generation about intermarriage, what it means, is a threat, blah, blah, blah. Truth is, the overwhelming majority of Americans right now reject the idea of opposing, you know, intermarriage because of religion and even of race. But the one kind of intermarriage they're opposed to, that all the polls, you know, the tracking polls of this tell us, is having their children marrying somebody from a different political party. That they can't stand. that they're opposed to. And that's a really, it's a very toxic factor. You know, if we are no longer able to agree to disagree about issues, even difficult issues, that really, you know, part of the whole conceit of democracy is that, you know, you debate, you vote. If your side loses, you know, you just let it go and you come back another time. You respect, you know, you support the other side when possible, you oppose when necessary. We're not doing that anymore. We're as a nation, we are, you know, Democrats were very eager to get rid of Donald Trump the last 4 years. I dare say if there's a President Biden, Republicans will be holding on to whatever grudges they have about this election and trying to do the same thing. We should be working against that. We should be counseling against that. I've always liked to believe that which we as Jews and as Americans, you know, that which we have in common is still greater than that which drives us apart. At times lately, I've been wondering about that, but I think we have to hold on to that, you know, if for no reason as a hope, even, you know, let's make it a reality if it isn't a reality right now, because we just need it.
Thanks.
I agree with the listening kind of part of Jonathan's answer, which is I think our organizations and our thinkers and sessions like these, I think we have to increase the number of voices. I think, and that includes by generation, get younger voices in the room.
Because saying something about us, Andy?
Excuse me?
Are we too old?
Yeah, a little bit. Not Jodi.
Yeah.
Hey, I'm getting there.
But, you know, to get, because you're going to be surprised what you hear from younger folks, and some of it is hair raising for an older generation, quite honestly. Diversity, Ashkenazi, Sephardi, Jews of color, men and women, and I think, and then coalitions also, which I know, again, that's JCPA's work, but reaching out to other people to understand where they're coming from, even when you don't agree with them, even when you sometimes revile some of the things they stand for. My biggest learning experiences have always been, and it's hard to tell you the truth, in the Jewish journalism sphere, our newsrooms are very homogenous. We're white Ashkenazi Jews for the most part. I mean, that's just the way it works. You know, that's who American Jewish community has long seen itself as. So most of my learning experiences have come from when you're put into some kind of relationship with the other. And that would be my suggestion.
I think I agree with both of you, but I just want to push us a little bit to think about the nature of the listening, and to think about humility, the Jewish virtue of anava. I think because what I worry about in terms of what I've been hearing all week is people who are like so surprised and worried that there are this many people in our country that are so different from them. How could this be? Because they're so sure of their own rightness. And I guess I think that the quality of that listening has to be about like really actually considering that the other opinion, the other perspective, the other experience is valid and right. And that like yours might even change if you learned more about that other, whatever that other is. And I think that like, that's what I feel like has changed in our discourse, is that there's not the quality of listening. If it is sort of a superficial, like, oh, we're having this debate between the sides. Even when I was listening to Jonathan earlier about the sides and which side, who's denouncing, on my side or your side. And it's like, I'm not on a side. And I'm just really like, wish there were more people who just were actually trying to understand the people who are different. If there was I feel like we used to presume that most people in the country were good people, smart people, whatever. And that like, if we really were profoundly different from them on some issue, like maybe we missed something. And I would like to get back more to that place of inquiry and humility and understanding, where there was a presumption, not a presumption that people who came out differently on a vote or an election or an issue were crazy, but that maybe we didn't understand how they got there. And there was like that process of trying to understand and to be open to the idea that what you thought you were so sure about, you were wrong.
Well, thank you. That is actually a perfect way to end. And I want to thank all of our panelists for, first of all, modeling the kind of political discussion that we emulate and we'd all like to see a lot more of. And surely taking the time out of what is beyond hectic to be with us this afternoon, to share your insights and your wisdom. And we would like to thank our viewers. We hope that you found this a valuable, informative, and pleasant. Everyone be well, and thank you for joining us. Good afternoon.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double high or more. Simply visit the JBS website at jbstv.org and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check to JBS, Post Office Box 360, Stamford, Connecticut 06904. Or you can call the JBS Pledge Line at 833-MY-JBS-TV. That's 833-695-2788. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. We thank you for your kind support.